So team, we've got a nice small group of us today, and many of you, all of you, well, maybe a Katie E. Katie, have you been to one of these before?
Hello, I have not.
Okay, well,
I saw this event just because I am a friend of Stephen Tootle's and he posted it and it sounded interesting to me.
Oh my God.
And well, that's about it.
I will tell you, he is amazing. But if you're a friend, you already know that. And so I think most. Go ahead, Steve. Okay, good.
I just haven't seen her in 10 years.
I love that.
Here
so
I
guys,
am.
we're just in small talk. We always let friends come in for like 5 minutes ahead of time while we plan the last details of the show. Sorry, we're 2 minutes late this time, but our expert is outlining the Facebook Live. We usually try to start on time or within a minute or two. A heads up for I think only Katie. Professor and I will talk for about 25 or 30 minutes, and I'm a little precise on that. I try to, even if we haven't finished the conversation, I try to stop it at about 30 minutes. And the reason for that is because we want you to ask questions. I mean, just because I think there's some interesting questions, who cares about me? You've dialed in and taken time out of your day, so why don't you have the chance? So get ready for some questions. As a reminder, in this show, before we start, are we recording already, Tony?
Yeah, we are just now going live on Facebook as of this second. So
okay, well, we'll start, and I'll explain that in a sec. So welcome, everyone. Today's discussion is the second in a series of what it means to be a Republican. About a month ago, on March 19th, the professor and I took a whole hour and 7 minutes actually, and I listened to most of it just now, about the history of the Republican Party. And it's really interesting. If you haven't had a chance to look that show up, it's on our YouTube channel. Please look it up. We'll put the link, Tony, if you can do that at some point, if you'll put it in, or Facebook message me and I'll tell you. It's really worthwhile listening to that. Professor, you came up with some, I've been a Republican all my life, and I'm a political science degree and a law degree, and you came up with some surprises for me on that. And so I've been pondering that. We decided to do another conversation on, though, what it means to be a Republican. And the professor may delve deep a couple times on a specific context, if that's been always true or sometimes true or not. But please don't make the mistake. This is not politics of a Republican or what's the winning issue, or that's actually a worthwhile show in itself, and we'll probably do. But this is not raw politics of why people are trying to get elected and how they're trying to maintain power. This is philosophy. This is core values. This is things that are important and why people act the way they do for their lifetime and generationally why they act. So it's a really important show for me, and it's a little bit awkward because, as a reminder for folks that don't know me, I was a lifelong Republican from age 18 to 49, and for the past 4.5 years, I'm not. So it's not about me, but I'm not alone. There's hundreds of thousands in Colorado and millions across the US that are like me. What does that mean in the context? Not politically, but what are my core values that make me still be in love with the Republican Party? Still to this day, even though I'm not certain much of the Republican Party views it that way anymore. It's a little too contemporary and political, but I do want everyone to know that I am not against the Republican Party. I like the Republican Party. I like most of my Republican friends. I think there's a lot of things that we should be really proud of. And I just laid that out as a context for our Q&A so people don't get mistaken that I'm trying to attack the Republican Party in any way. I'm not. Professor, why don't you now take a couple minutes in whatever way you want to go off my introduction and talk about your Republican background and the setting, how you'd like to discuss it. Welcome, Professor Tootle.
Well, hi, I'm a lifelong Republican from, worked my first campaign in junior high to being vice chair of the Republican Party in my county for more than a decade, recently stepped aside a couple of years ago, but again, lifelong Republican. I prefer to think of these issues in terms of principles rather than issues. I would often say that one of the differences and distinctions we would make between Republicans and Democrats is we're not supposed to be a coalition party. They are. And they are supposed to be a coalition of people who have agreed to advance specific issues, we're not actually supposed to be that way. We're supposed to be based on a set of pluralistic principles. And that means that our parties are not supposed to be the opposite of one another. They're both different vehicles for an underlying philosophy. So I always begin by saying, if you are, again, the principles, the philosophy, you should, if you're a Republican, believe that the flaws of mankind are eternal and were correctly identified by the founding generation. And that means that human beings in the past were not genetically different than the human beings are today, the same DNA, we have the same sins and dreams and foibles, but that human beings are not capable of perfection. And that means that, to use the big word that some of the intellectuals use, they say, don't amnetize the eschaton, which is just a fancy way of saying, don't bring about the end of the world. You should not try to create heaven on earth. The purpose of government is not to create heaven on earth, because that is impossible, because human beings are flawed. So the next thing is that if you think about, all right, human beings are flawed, then what is a government? Governments are instituted by human beings, but it's instituted by flawed human beings in order to secure rights. And there are two parts to this assertion. The first means that the rights themselves are perfect, but you should never expect a permanent solution to any problem, because any permanent solution to a problem is actually a recipe for totalitarianism. Pretending that there's one issue that we should organize all of society around is called monism. It's the opposite of our system of government. And you are a totalitarian if you want to organize all of society around a single principle.
Professor, this is like the deepest in words that I've got to Google now after the show that you've ever done. And this is like the opposite of the last 5 or 6 years, man. We're street fighters. We are, this is like Twitter dome, man. What are you doing using all these fancy words?
Sorry, monism just means mono, like one. So plural means many. So we believe that there are many principles that have to be balanced, not just that there's one principle that everything should be organized around. And so the purpose of politics is to peacefully work towards these ideals, knowing that we will always fall short. So we have to work towards these perfect ideals, more than one of them, simultaneously, peacefully, knowing that we will always fall short of our founding ideals. So, that is at its core how we should view government. The next sort of organizing principle that makes us different is that your rights attach to you as an individual, not as a member of a group. And that might be the biggest distinction between Republicans and Democrats. The next big issue is that Republicans are supposed to believe in, we've talked about this concept before, but subsidiarity, which is a big word, but it just means that we want anything that needs to be handled by society, we want it handled by the people closest to the problem. And one of the problems of the 80s and 90s and afterwards is that somehow it became shorthand to say that Republicans believe in small government and Democrats believe in big government. And that's not necessarily true. That's what Republicans are supposed to believe in is that we want the appropriate level of government solving the problem, so that we don't want, yeah, go ahead.
I also used in shorthand, and I think for about 25 years, and I think now inaccurately, I'm in favor of states' rights, is what I said as a Republican. But I think in hindsight, it meant something, and sometimes correctly and often not correctly. So weave that into your history as well.
I would just say there's a reason why I never used that phrase, and that's because it was so tainted with the Southern perspective, because people said states' rights, but what they really meant is we want to interpret the Constitution in order to justify racism. So but and then you didn't, you don't want to be associated with that, because here's the other thing and here's why it's not appropriate to use states' rights to describe Republican principles, because, for instance, in the years after the Civil War, the states could not protect the rights of Black people And so Ulysses S. Grant sent the army back into the states. Dwight Eisenhower, the states were not protecting the rights of Black people. Eisenhower sent the airborne into the states, and those were both thoroughly Republican actions. So if the states prove unable or unwilling to protect the rights of individuals within their states, it's fully within the rights of the federal government to intervene in those cases. So,
And,
yeah.
and I'm glad I interrupted you on that, Professor, because I think that's one of those notable things. I managed campaigns and got elected twice as a county commissioner, and I used states' rights in Colorado. Maybe it's different regionally, but in Colorado, I used it very commonly and comfortably and proudly.
Well,
And
it's
it
not
may be
states
doing
have
a disservice.
Yeah, well, states do have rights, but so do counties, and so do cities, and so does the federal government. And so it's not inappropriate to say that I believe that a state should assert its proper role within this framework. It's just that can't be the only organizing principles. The individual has rights, the city has rights, the family has rights, and states have rights, and the federal government has rights, and every level of government also has duties and responsibilities. So I would just say it's not incorrect. It just always needs to be put into its proper context. So the next thing that is the eternal Republican principle is believing in economic opportunity instead of using the government in order to bring about equality of condition. That would be another distinction between Republicans and Democrats. In other words, we want to preserve everyone's opportunity, and it is appropriate at every level of government to do things that would provide economic opportunity. So it was Republicans who built the Transcontinental Railroad. It was Republicans who built the interstate highway system. These are all things that provided for economic opportunity, both for individuals and for states and cities and counties. And it's entirely appropriate for the federal government in some cases to engage in large scale projects for economic opportunity. And the difference is we don't ever want to get into the business of telling people how to live their lives or what to want in life. And when you start saying that you want equality of condition, you start saying, well, this group of Americans is somehow less successful because they don't want the same things in life. And I certainly don't want to bring that about. And so what we actually say that we want is we want people to have the conditions so that as many people as possible can flourish. So one of the ways of putting this is that we want equal opportunity for everyone, special privilege for no one. And the next one is the preservation of ideals, the preservation of representative government, which is should appropriately be called American exceptionalism. Too often people use this phrase American exceptionalism and think that what it means is that America is better than every place else. Well, I mean, I think America is better, but that's not how the founders would have understood this concept. And it's not how the people who used it initially would have understood it. American exceptionalism is the understanding that because of our history, we have a unique role to play in the world. And our role to play in the world is to prove to the world that human beings can govern themselves. And because we need to be able to demonstrate that human beings can govern themselves, our government must always consider as a foreign policy implication the success of representative institutions here. So in other words, I mean, for instance, Dwight Eisenhower famously understood this when he shifted national security policy in the 1950s and said, we have to make sure that we're waging the Cold War, but not losing what makes America special. And to me, that's a perfect encapsulation of what American exceptionalism is really all about. The preservation of democratic institutions here at home so that we can serve as an example abroad that representative government works. And then the next thing that is our belief that true conservatism is about moderation in making progress towards realizing our principles. don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That what we want from our politicians is something that is better than what it replaced, and that's it. not perfection. And the other thing is the relationship between politics and culture. We should probably want our politics reflecting culture slowly rather than the other way around. It doesn't mean that we don't feel passionately about contemporary cultural issues, whatever they are, but we just want to be extremely cautious before we begin shoving our beliefs and giving the force of the government behind our cultural belief system. You want to make sure that you're not trampling on essential freedoms when you're trying to advance some sort of cultural purpose. And that's because we all have within us the capacity for good and evil. We all have a version of our best selves and our worst selves. And we want the government reflecting culture after a reasonable and thoughtful debate over what will be lost and what would be gained in a policy proposal. So, and none of this means that you're a bad person if you don't believe in this stuff. But it just means you're not a Republican, and it certainly means you're not a conservative. And you'll notice that when I discussed all of these things, I didn't mention any issues, just principles. But I think that's a good starting point, because it doesn't really matter what the issue is. If you agree on the principles, it means that we can begin advancing these issues that we care about and making sure that we preserve what is unique and special and wonderful about being a Republican. And also, I would say, what is unique and special and wonderful about the United States.
So, Professor, and partially because I interrupted you, but if my memory's right, or as I was listening to you and from my memory, it seems like you put three main buckets of being a Republican, and then maybe two overarching philosophical concepts. I'm not sure that's right, but do you mind, just in case we ever want to do a clip, do you mind succinctly giving us those three and the two overriding philosophical?
Yeah, so the three big ones that are always there: individual liberty, economic opportunity, and American exceptionalism. Those are the three sort of legs of the stool. Individual liberty, I mean, and this is what I just described. I just did it in longer form, but bullet points work too. So individual liberty, economic opportunity, and American exceptionalism are the three big ones that are the distinctives, meaning they're pretty distinct from how Democrats would approach it. So those are the big three. Then the kind of other two are about human nature being not perfect. So we want to make sure that we engage in pluralism in our politics, and then subsidiarity. So the three big ones are individual liberty, economic opportunity, and American exceptionalism. And then the other two concepts would be the sort of flawed nature of mankind. So how we have to structure our pluralistic system, and then wanting the level of government closest to the problem, solving the problem. Or
Excellent.
Lincoln, before he was a Republican, I'm sure I always use this Lincoln quote, but Lincoln said, "The proper role of government is to do for a community of citizens what they cannot do or do so well for themselves in their separate but individual capacity, and in all other things, government ought not to interfere." Or something very close to that. I don't know if I got it word for word, but it's
and so all of that still resonates with me today. It's the reason I was a Republican for most of my life. So I've got two documents here that I'd like to share. And for team, Anthony told you that we're going to start Q&A for everyone in about 10 minutes. This is the state recommendation. It was on the Facebook page if anyone wants to look at it later. It's about from the late 80s or early 90s. Don Bain was the chairman, but I tried to find out when this was actually written, but I couldn't. It starts out with, "I'm a Republican because I believe it's important to respect each person's ability, dignity, freedom, and responsibility."
individual liberty.
That fits in your buckets.
Yeah.
"I believe individual initiative must be encouraged in getting things done."
Opportunity rather than condition.
I believe government exists to protect the freedom of each individual, not restrict it.
Individual liberty.
I believe people who cannot provide for themselves deserve help and also deserve to be helped to become self-supporting citizens who can take pride in their self-reliance and independence.
Individual liberty and economic opportunity.
I believe equal rights, equal justice, and equal opportunity are everybody's rights.
Yes. All right. Individual liberty. Yeah.
I believe respect for laws, the courts, and the Constitution are vital to preservation of the nation and security of the citizen.
That's American exceptionalism.
I believe excessive taxation, inflation, and government waste can destroy our country. Government must maintain sound money and a responsible economy.
Well, and that's actually all three because of what it would require of government. Yeah.
I believe while we remain militarily strong, we must continue our efforts towards world peace and friendship.
Yeah. Subsidiarity and individual liberty. Yeah.
So these principles, this is the final part of it, reflect a Republican's basic beliefs. Republican has held these firm for nearly a century and a quarter. The nation needs more Republicans today so our nation can be stronger tomorrow. That's the best reason to be a Republican. Pretty good little flyer in the 80s or 90s. Anything contradictory?
No. I mean, I think the only thing I would say now is that maybe a modern audience would probably also want to hear more or hear those same principles also related to individual human flourishing. That what we want, and this is the way I often put it to audiences, that what we want is for you to be able to live your version of a successful life. We want you to be able to define how you will flourish in life.
Love it. I have one more specific question, and it's from the 1994 Republican State Assembly report of the Resolutions Committee. I may have been on that committee, which is maybe the reason I still have this document. There's 10 of them, and we might get to some of these or we might not. But the first one, which is your whole presentation so far, I find this completely remarkable. I'll tell you the punchline first. Out of 3,245 people that attended the State Assembly with me in 1994 in Colorado, 3,217 of them, which is 99.13% of every Republican in probably a Big Mac or wherever, maybe we were down in Colorado Springs, agreed to this statement. Colorado Republicans affirm the basic principles of our party, protecting the rights of the individual, an individual initiative, free enterprise, fiscal responsibility, and maintaining government at the lowest practical level. 99.137%. There was 28 people that voted no, that they don't believe in that for one reason or another. But Professor, my point by bringing this up is this is not just your opinion as a historian. This is like universally. I mean, people knew it in Colorado, but they knew it in other states. They knew it in big cities. They knew it in small towns. This is like bread and butter Republican stuff, is it not?
No, and I would say, I'm not just giving you my opinion. I would say one of the things that's shocking about when you look at the history of the Republican Party is that those principles are in the founding documents of the individual Americans who came together spontaneously to create the Republican Party before they even had a name. I mean, those
pre-Lincoln. I mean, concurrently with Lincoln.
This is before Lincoln was even a Republican. So not only can you look at the, I originally derived my list after looking at all of the party platforms from 1856 to, at the time, I guess the first time I did this was in the 2000s. So, I kind of looked at the first 150 years, but just the national party. But in subsequent years, I've also looked at the founding documents of the state level parties from before, as the Republican Party was forming. And what is shocking to me is that the Republican Party essentially formed because Americans felt like the Supreme Court had just ruled their political beliefs unconstitutional and illegal. and therefore came together spontaneously asserting, no, this is what we believe as Americans, and created the Republican Party. So it's so far and so deep into our DNA. I would say it's not my opinion. I'm just summarizing what's there in the documents.
Okay. And I'm doing this to model potential questions from our small group of friends here today. So thank you. We're going to start in just a couple of minutes. Freedom of choice in healthcare. When people wonder why Republicans aren't in favor of Obamacare or the shocking, in 94% were against in Colorado of Republican activists of any kind of freedom and choice in healthcare. They didn't want government involved in this. This is back to 94. Shocking. It's not a new thing. It's not that we don't care about people. It's going back to your principles. Balanced budget amendment. 94% believe in a balanced budget amendment. I don't know what happened in the last couple decades since 94, but yuck. I think most Republicans still believe in that, but for some reason we're not doing it. Any response to that, Professor? And I don't mean to get this into issues yet, but
I would just say that I remember the Republican counterproposal in healthcare was to essentially give money to people who wanted to buy health insurance but couldn't afford it. And to me, that's in keeping with Republican principles. Let's help people who A, want help, B, need help, and are asking for help. What I think most Republicans, and I certainly had this issue on a very personal level, which is the federal government mandating me to buy a commercial product at the federal level. It seemed like such an invasion of my personal freedom. And when I remember participating in a community forum at the time, and some young man stood up and said, I agree with you 100%. I'm not going to buy healthcare, and I don't want anybody forcing me to. And I stopped him and said, you should buy healthcare. You should buy health insurance. I'm telling you that it is your duty as a human being to take care of yourself and your fellow man. What I disagree with is the federal government forcing you to buy this commercial product. And forcing people, I mean, there were a lot of other reasons to be opposed to how the Affordable Care Act was structured, not to get into the weeds on that, but there are certainly ways that we see these principles play out when it comes to these individual issues.
Cool. So right to bear arms. Last week we did a show on the Second Amendment and gun control. In 1994 in Colorado, 94.7% of Republicans, 2,598 of them to 165. Colorado Republicans affirm the right of citizens to keep and bear arms as recognized in both the United States and Colorado constitutions. And of course, that was before the 2008 Heller decision. So it actually means something slightly different then than it does now. But Republicans are constantly attacked for not wanting to solve the problem in gun control today. The Democrats are just besides themselves why we won't take an affirmative advocacy position in removing guns from bad people. Put into history how that kind of issue fits into the framework of being a Republican.
Well, it's not so. I would just say that there's no as we discussed last week, there's no Second Amendment issue that interferes with the prosecution of crimes. And so prosecuting human beings who commit crimes has never been contrary to any Republican principle. And what I sort of object to is this: we get put into this false choice narrative of saying that this thing that we want to do as a matter of law enforcement at the state or local level is or isn't this thing called gun control. And if it is gun control, we're against it. And if it isn't gun control, we're for it. And I find it to be, it almost never has anything to do with A, solving an actual criminal problem, enforcement of criminal law, and it is almost always of symbolic nature. And we just see the two sides kind of line up and not accomplish anything. But I think that if we couch that in terms of, one of my issues where I would like to see more action at the state level in particular is having laws that protect domestic partners, but making sure that there are limitations to those laws that protect Second Amendment rights. So, in other words, one of the things that has been shown at the state level that does work to prevent gun violence in domestic violence situations is when you have some ability to remove a firearm for a short period of time. And I would say if this does in fact work, and it seems like a good solution at the state level, not at the federal level, what I would say is I would want something like that, but I would also want something like that with the proper protection that says that only a judge can do it, because we already have the principle that judges can modify rights in terms of emergencies for a short period of time, but only a judge can do it, and it won't be permanent. And with those modifications, there's no constitutional issue. And what I would like to see is that states in particular, now, I guess somebody could roll out of bed and call this gun control. But to me, it's not necessarily gun control. It's just another tool that law enforcement can use in order to diffuse a potentially violent situation for a short period of time and make that situation safer for everybody involved, law enforcement and domestic partners.
Cool. So team, we're going to start Q&A in 45 seconds. To give you a flavor, to tee up your questions, please go philosophical and big first, and then maybe we can have some practical questions if you'd like I just did. Because we're going to do future shows, and see some of the ones we were considering doing, and maybe even as early as next week or two, is the history and laws of the LGBTQ community and cultural acceptance of them. What's the history on that? Abortion, immigration, a deep dive into the rule of law, the illiberal movement versus the classical liberalism. We're probably going to have our first guest speaker, just not because Professor Tootle isn't great at history, but he just has a dear friend of his that is really good at military history. So we're going to delve into the history of the military in the United States. We'll probably dive into Southern monuments and Confederate flag and the Civil War. And are we really still fighting that today? Is that what a lot of this is about? And abortion? Maybe. And we might likely go back to impeachment and figure out why people still can't understand the difference between a political process and a legal process, or a legal versus civil and criminal. Because we want people to be more thoughtful in their arguments. Even if they disagree with us, we want them to be armed with all the appropriate ammunition. So however you would like to start asking your questions and answers, realizing we're going to do more shows, but on the currency of the Republican Party and what they believe in. What does it mean to be a Republican? What are your questions? And best to raise your hand, Frank. Go for it.
So they were introducing the sponsors of the bill to increase the number of Supreme Court justices. Made two different occasions when I was listening, suggesting that the Republicans have destroyed democracy, destroyed American democracy. I mean, that's a big statement to make. Republicans have destroyed democracy? Have we?
Professor.
I hope not. Yeah, I don't. I think that's although there were many Republicans who have not exactly covered themselves in glory over the past 5 years, because I would say many of them have abandoned their principles for the sake of political expediency over the last 5 years.
But that's a different answer to a different question, Professor. Frank, wasn't your question on the Supreme Court? And maybe we need to expand it by 4 members to take over the Stam liberal court, or and wait, Republicans are ruining everything. And talk to us. Ask again.
No, I think my question was whether the things that the Republican Party has been doing over the last 20 years, have we destroyed democracy? But
I guess the answer is we don't know yet, because as Joe Strummer from The Clash used to say, the future is unwritten, meaning that if democracy falls, yes, we will look back on this day and say it's probably the fault of Republicans for not adhering to our principles. Because I can't tell you how often my liberal friends have talked to me over the past few years and said, you know, I could only be a liberal as long as conservatives, Republicans were being Republicans. You know, in other words, I couldn't advocate for my crazy stuff over the past few years because I was so worried because there was no counterbalance to my argument that I was making. It was like I was going crazy and they were going crazy, and there was nobody saying let's not be crazy. So I think one of the things that has bothered me is this idea that somehow the Republican Party needs to be a mirror image of the Democratic Party, and that's why years ago, Frank, I don't know if you were at this earlier talk, but I said back in the mid 90s, I started describing these people who joined the Republican Party as populist anti-liberals, because they were people who hated Democrats, but they held no Republican beliefs. And what, you know, really shocked me over the past 5 years is that it seemed like the populist anti-liberals were in charge. And these are people who, as far as I was concerned, weren't conservatives, weren't Republicans, held no Republican beliefs, but they did hate liberals. But when I would explain this to my students, you guys remember Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck? There was a cartoon where they said it's wabbit season, no, it's duck season. And Bugs wins the argument by starting to say it's wabbit season, and then Donald Duck then starts saying it's duck season, and then Elmer Fudd shoots him in the face. Well, that's what happens if you let your political opponents define your political beliefs. Because you're going to wake up one day and Democrats are going to say, no, it's wabbit season, and then you're going to tell Elmer Fudd to shoot you in the face. Because my political beliefs are not designed and defined by merely being the opposite of what Democrats do. I've got my own beliefs. They don't define me, I define me. So yes, I'm usually opposed to them, but I define my own political beliefs. They aren't defined in opposition to what the other side is doing.
So, Frank, with your permission, we're going to skip on, but I'm going to add an editorial moment on this. Oh, wait, did you want to keep going?
No, I'm saying go.
I am shocked again, which is why I like these conversations. So here you've got a lifelong Republican who abandoned the Republican Party over this issue. And I'm more optimistic. I actually think that somehow these Republican principles and philosophy that we've talked about is going to dominate in a huge way. And I'm not saying you're pessimistic. Well, I guess I am, Professor. So bounce back at me, because I'm telling you, I think that when most people understand what Republicans are really about, they're not mean-spirited. They're not angry. They're not trying to put the foot on anybody. They're not trying to hold back minorities. They're not trying to hold back women or gays or it's just a different way of looking at life, that they want certainty and planning. They want the rule of law. You argue about things in the right way at the right time. And if you lose, you work harder the next election and you use the systems. And so even though I'm not in the party, still think it's a great foundation of which to build from in the future. Quick retort to that, and we'll go to the next question.
I would just say, I hope so.
Yeah, because you're still in it.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, hope
but
so.
We had two other questions. Who was
yeah.
that?
Eric.
Well, thanks. So I'd like to read back one of the points on the card that John read early on. I believe people who cannot provide for themselves deserve help and also deserve to be helped, become self-supporting citizens who can take pride in their self-reliance and independence. Seems to be that one of the defining distinctions between the two major parties is the degree to which and the manner in which that help is provided, with some at the very rightward extent of the Republican Party saying, no, there shouldn't be any individual help at all. And maybe to the very leftward extent of the Democratic Party saying, all the help possible as needed. And so just to say that in that, when John was reading those off and Professor Tootle assigned that one to individual liberty and economic opportunity, it's not simply that, because providing help is not in and of itself economic opportunity, it's providing help, which is really more of a democratic value than a Republican value.
Awesome question. Professor.
Yeah, I would just say that I think it depends on your definition of the word help, because the way it's put into that card that John read off, that the idea of help, I mean, I think about like, what does it mean to be a good parent? Like my goal is that my kids will one day be self-sufficient and they'll be able to take care of themselves. So what I consider help one day might be, today I'm just going to put my arm around you and tell you it's going to be okay, because that might be what you need on that specific day. But there are going to be other times when I'm going to insist that my kids learn things and hold fast to rules, because the goal is that one day you'll be self-sufficient. And I tell them, your goal is not to just take care of yourself. The idea is that one day you will be independent enough to not just take care of yourself, but to take care of others. And that is your duty as an individual. And it's not a duty that you can put off on someone else. One of the things that has always bothered me about how liberals or Democrats will sometimes define charity or kindness is, I'm going to take money away from someone else and give it to myself, and I consider that to be generosity. I don't find that to be generous. I think that it is up to the individuals to take care of the people who are around them. You have an individual duty to take care of the people around you. And when you take it and you say that the federal government is going to solve this problem for you, number one, you're really stretching subsidiarity beyond all recognition of a concept, right? Because here you have an individual who's struggling and you're saying, we're going to come up with a law in Washington, D.C. to help you. I mean, that's the opposite of subsidiarity. So I don't necessarily, but I also just take exception to the idea that somehow what Republicans want is less kind. I think that the kindness is in wanting what's best for people. And I mean, I also think that there's nothing that ruins a kid more than having a trust fund. Like I tell my kids, you're getting nothing. Yeah. So I don't think that just giving people stuff is a kindness, and I don't call that generosity either.
So, Professor, it gives us an opportunity to kind of gratuitously, but deservedly gratuitously so, to shout out Arthur Brooks, who of AEI, where we both met, who constantly speaks on the dignity and the value of productive work at whatever level, cleaning the street, cleaning a toilet, whatever level, is something that should be part of society. And there's a clear difference on that. So quick follow-up, Eric, then we'll go to someone else.
Yes, a very quick follow-up. So Professor Tootle, in the context of the discussion of healthcare reform, you pointed out that Republicans believe in helping to the degree of providing some subsidy, perhaps, for someone who cannot afford healthcare. So I guess returning to the original question, in contradistinction from what you just said, well, providing material help is within your framework as you defined it in that context.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't understand the contradiction.
Well, simply that it sounded like what you were more recently saying was, well, it shouldn't be material help. It should be, putting an arm around and, maybe providing some sort of incentive in a way, but not subsidizing. But earlier you said, yes, subsidizing.
Well, here's the problem, and that is that we certainly want to provide people who want help, need help with opportunity. But at a certain point, wherever you place that help creates almost like a hump or a barrier, because let's say, and I'll just give you a real world kind of example. Let's say that you give a child tax credit for childcare, you know, and you couch this as this is going to be something that is helpful for the working class. Well, at some point you have to create some sort of cutoff and say, well, the minute that you earn $35,000, you're going to lose this subsidy. And what you've just created there is now a disincentive to make $36,000 a year. Does that make sense? No?
Not asking you
No,
to
no, sure. I
agree,
mean,
but
I've
does it
heard-
make
I'm
sense?
not asking you to agree.
right,
I'm just
no.
asking you, does that make sense? That
Yeah, well,
and when you do it in tax policy, if you do it with child health, if you do it with healthcare, if you do it with childcare, wherever you put this help, it creates a disincentive at the barrier, at the point at which it is removed. So, you know, for instance, we talk about this in California.
right. So then it sounds like what you're saying is that the government. Right. I mean, it's all about nuance, and it's all about how things are designed, and whether it's, you know, phasing out over a period of time versus having a strict income limit forever. There are ways to handle this, but the principle that you were just defining would say, okay, no subsidies for healthcare, strictly speaking.
I would say,
Because if the principle is you shouldn't set like a dollar wealth or income level for providing help, well, that means no one gets help.
no, absolutely not. That is not at all what I was advocating. That I would say absolutely there is room for helping people who need help, who want help, and making sure that we don't create an incentive to stay on this forever.
Cool. We're going to go to lots to talk about, Eric, and hopefully you'll sign on for more shows because you've got the liberal advocacy down, and it's appreciated. Bill, you're up.
Yeah, thank you. Stephen, historically, looking back at the Republican Party as an institution, both nationally and in individual states, is there any particular period in history that stands out to you when the Republican Party institutionally was really firing on all cylinders, taking these principles and building planks or whatever, taking the principles and saying therefore, and proactively defining solutions for us that they could articulate and advocate going forward?
Well, let's think about, I mean, what's really remarkable is that between 1860 and 1932, that is a 72-year period. And in that 72-year period, you have 2 elected Democratic presidents. The only 2 people who were Democrats who were elected president were Grover Cleveland to non-consecutive terms and Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson was only elected because of the Republican Party being split in 2. And so I'd say that 72-year period was probably where we would have the most consistent philosophy being implemented. And it's also because we're coming out of the Civil War experience. And then the next period, the next sort of 3 eras where you have a pretty successful Republican Party were the 1920s, the 1950s, and the 1980s. And largely because of, you have 2 of the 3, with Reagan being the exception, really steeped in the history and beliefs of the Republican Party. Reagan is a somewhat unique figure because he was a Democrat who converted and then acquired a lot of the his conservatism via the intellectual movement rather than via the political movement. So in a way, Reagan is kind of the exception, which means that his version of conservatism was slightly different than what you would call matching up precisely to the Republican Party vision. And I know that seems like heresy to a lot of people, but Reagan was just different. He came up as a Democrat, and he read more political philosophy and non-American political philosophy than most politicians would have.
Is that good, Bill?
Yeah, I guess the follow-up question is, are there lessons learned from success that point to a better future now for the Republican Party than what we seem to have?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I'd say that if you were to articulate a Republican Party vision, like I would just say, historically speaking, these are beliefs that are acceptable to 80-ish% of Americans. So if you would like to at least be outlining a political philosophy where 80-ish% of Americans would at least listen to you, you should probably adhere to the old formula.
Thanks.
Fair enough, Bill?
Yes,
okay, good.
thank you.
Now, Commissioner Jerky. And I know you were a state representative and all, but I'm going for the most noble of office. Commissioner Jerky.
Okay. I want to go in a little weird, different direction for a moment. I'm really growing more and more concerned with democracy. Frank brought that up a little while ago about the notion of democracy. Why can't we just figure out a way to call this thing a republic all the time? We democratically elect representatives, but this raw democracy, the founders were scared to death of it. That's why we've got, everything from filibusters to, requiring cloture in the Senate to the 17th Amendment obviously got rid of the popular vote for, or the Senate vote for the Senate, legislation. Let me back up. Legislators voting in their given states to place U.S. senators. So we've had all these things that were there originally, and now it seems like we're growing more and more and more towards raw democracy. And obviously, it's a feeling that when people can vote themselves largesse out of the Treasury, that they will do that. And I'll mention that, for example, in 2012, Mitt Romney talked about the 47%. And basically pay no tax. And when that was brought up, this ship was really sunk. So how do we begin to work our way out of that, especially when we're dealing with people who are writing checks by the trillion because of this horrible cold virus that we've had that does kill people on occasion, but it's been a nasty little virus. And now we have to spend trillions of dollars to further endure forever people who are now dependent, even more dependent on their federal government. And this probably doesn't relate real well to R versus D, but still it's a real problem that I've got with the notion of raw democracy, which is right now is what we've got.
Yeah, it's a great question. And Commissioner, not Commissioner, unless you want to run for office, Professor, a fairly brief answer to a very complex, big question.
I would just say, to remind you, and Americans probably need to be reminded that our government was founded in opposition to democracy. So after the revolution, we had a democratic government under the Articles of Confederation, and it led to the ending of rule of law and the ending of, and representative government in America was failing precisely because it was too democratic. And so the founders specifically set up our system in opposition to that, because we already had an experiment with a more democratic form of government, and it failed. It was called the Articles of Confederation. So I have, it does seem like one of the things that is frustrating to me, and I had this feeling more and more over the last few years, but as an educator, you just think, what am I doing? Whatever I'm doing isn't working, because I never thought that we would simply lose our sense of national purpose by choice. One of the things that was scary to me is I would often begin my classes by saying, what is America's national purpose? And students didn't even know. And I would just say that if you don't even know what our government is supposed to be doing, how can you have an opinion on whether or not they're doing a good job? How can you even judge success? You don't even know what we're supposed to be doing. It's like saying, is that football team winning? Without knowing that you win football games by scoring points. How can you? And so I would just say, I agree with you, but we have we now have kind of three, if we conceive of a generation in teachers as being about 15 years rather than 20, we now have sort of 3 generations of civic ignorance. And it's shocking to me that we might lose our representative government simply because we don't know what it is.
So you have a quick follow-up, Bill? Or are you good with that?
Just a real quick specific. Do you have me now?
Yeah, go.
Related directly to the election we just had in November, I'm curious about one thing about us having states' rights, states running elections, and the Georgia election for U.S. Senate. How come we have a situation in which 2 Republicans wind up getting the most votes in November, but they didn't get a majority? And as a result of not getting a majority, they wind up having this kind of runoff election, R versus D. And that allows a lot of things to happen, including Donald Trump to cause problems there. And so as a result of that, we wind up having a 50-50 US Senate, when if they would have followed, I believe, the rules of the other 49 states, I think that majority simply, or not majority, but whoever got the most votes in November would have prevailed.
So with your permission, both of you, we'll do a whole thing on election law, the history of election law. I think that's a really interesting topic, but to respect your question, like a 15 to 20 second answer. Professor.
Every state has their own rules,
By constitution.
Yeah.
You put yourself on mute again, Bill. Quickly.
And how do you hold the rest of the country hostage because of this bizarre, unique rule in one state, 1 year where we have 2 US senators elected, incredibly unique, and the whole thing falls apart for me, at least for 2 years because of that?
Quick response.
To say like, well, we stick to the principle and we don't say we're going to decide what we believe in based on the outcome. We believe in the principle. And we know that sometimes that means that we aren't going to win every time.
Or that an individual state does something that we just simply wouldn't do in our state. And we have to kind of, so we're going to go like 2 or 3 minutes over with your permission, just to do a quick lightning round. Ben, you usually have a thoughtful question. Same thing, Frank. Katie would love to have a question from a friend of the professors. Ken Weibel, you're only libertarian in the group. Come on. And Councilman Bill Miller, jump in. So who's up? Ben, quickly.
Okay, quickly. One of the things that, first off, I'm going to blame my wife for getting me involved in politics, because until we got married, I wasn't interested at all. But what I'm seeing is more of an us versus them versus ideal versus ideal. And how do we get past that?
Love that question. Professor, lightning round.
The first step is understanding your own belief system, because once you understand your own belief system, when people challenge it, you don't have to take it as a personal attack, right? Because in other words, if you don't have your own personal belief system defined, you have nothing to rely on other than identity. You just say, I'm me, they're them, therefore I disagree with them. But if you actually have your own political philosophy, you know how to incorporate this criticism into it and say, well, that's not what I believe, and but maybe we can work together on 98% of the rest of the agenda.
Boy, that's a big cultural issue, Ben. So we'll probably go back to that kind of conversation too. Of the hatred between R's and D's, it's actually a false argument. It's a mistake of culture that we're doing. So we'll talk about that as well. Come on, Katie, Ken, or Bart, you're up. Or Tony, man, I don't mean to be ignoring you, but Katie, you're up.
Hi. It's nice to see faces. I'm way out of my comfort zone here, but
So nice to do so.
I do feel like I'm kind of on a, I'm not going to say a quest, but trying to just understand and really frame what I truly believe about politics and how that's going to play out over the rest of my life and my family's life. So it's interesting for me to just kind of start thinking more about it, asking the questions, and being part of things like this.
And you live in Georgia.
I do live in Georgia.
And you're
You want
madder
to
than hell and
your
not
favorite
going to take
electoral?
it anymore.
Yeah. No, we
Okay.
met in Ohio. Yeah. But yeah, lives in Georgia now.
Nice. Katie, you're always welcome here, and I'll try not to put you on the spot like that again in the future if you don't want to, but thank you for being here.
Thank you for
Now, Councilman Miller, you're welcome, or see you, Commissioner. Councilman Miller or Ken Weibel, I'm expecting both of you to do a quick Q&A before we hang up. Councilman Miller.
Stephen, do you think it makes sense for people on both sides, I guess, of the political divide to get to know better the fundamental principles of people on the other side?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that is, I feel like I end up defending liberals a lot because, poor liberals. One of my close friends is a professor at Gannon, and he's an old liberal. And I used to sort of make fun of him because I was like, oh, the left took over your party, and how sad that is for you guys. And then look what happened to mine, and in a way we sort of commiserate now because it is just, I never use the term left unless I mean someone who is an actual leftist. And I always define a liberal, an American liberal, as sharing all of the same principles as an American conservative, but in a pluralistic system, merely emphasizing different ones. Whereas if you are a true leftist, you actually want the destruction of the United States. You want to undo all of classical liberalism. You don't believe in any of the rights that are protected under the Constitution.
And that's the same on the right as well, right, Professor?
Yeah, I would say the same thing, right? If you're on the right, you are opposed to the United States. The United States should be about people who are arguing about the organizing principles that we all agree on and merely emphasizing different ones. So, and then that is the debate, or it should be the debate. But people who are arguing from the right and from the left, the real right and the real left, carefully and properly defined, are arguing for the destruction of the American system of government. Anybody who, again, all of this is dependent upon people really understanding what these words mean, because you want to make sure and not offend someone unnecessarily who says, oh, I'm on the left. And really this person just sort of is a liberal, but they don't actually want the abolishment of the family. They don't want the abolishment of all private property. Or maybe they do. And you say, well, okay, well now then you are on the left. But I think every discussion becomes more fruitful and profitable if you understand what you actually believe in.
And we've done a whole segment on just the meaning of words. So if that interests you, please look that up on our YouTube channel. Excellent question, Commissioner Miller. Our best chef among the whole group, we have a gourmet chef amongst us, Chef Weibel. You're our only libertarian, most likely, too. So you kind of look libertarian, actually, or a chef, or a pot dealer, or maybe a brewer.
Oh, come on. You teased me about that when we first met.
Ask away. Ask Professor Tootle a question. Welcome.
I don't really have a question. Because I really admire those three legs of what the Republican principles are. And that's why I used to be a Republican. And it's the other issues that I think you will have further discussions on later.
You're talking
where
gays, abortion, the social issues.
That's where I, kind of fell away from that. But I really appreciate people learning to know where they sit so that they can make a stand. It's the apathy that really drives me bonkers in America. So
that's true.
I really appreciate this, John, and
You're welcome.
great scenario.
I'm glad you're welcome back, Professor. Do you have an enticement to our libertarian in the crowd to become you?
Well, I would just, no, the thing is that to be I always say I like libertarians because they tend to do good research because they're usually not beholden to the political agendas that can often pull research in different directions. So, and some of my best friends are libertarians. I would say, like, many people define themselves as libertarians for precisely the same reason. They just say, I can't simply be a part of a group that is opposed to some notion of freedom that I find really important. And I simply say, to my libertarian friends, hopefully we can find a lot of common ground. And I'm not, it's funny because I'm not opposed to libertarianism. Where I sort of draw the line is in the subsidiarity argument. This is where I would sometimes be at cross purposes with libertarians who sometimes argue for less government at the local level. And I'm not always for less government at the local level. So I always say, I remember being at AEI and having this argument with a libertarian there, where he actually used the opposite of the example I always use, which is to say, if Santa Cruz wants to pass a crazy law that applies only to Santa Cruz, if I lived in Santa Cruz, I would oppose it. But I don't live in Santa Cruz, God bless them. If that's the way they want to live, God bless them. My problem is when they want that law to apply to me in my home far away. But sometimes I found, and this is the only sort of consistent area of where I disagree with libertarians, is when they simply want no government at any level. And I just think that there is a role for robust government at every level. And in particular, I would say at the national level, when it comes to enforcing civil rights. I mean, that tends to be another source of friction sometimes with libertarians.
Great question and answer, Professor. I know we're way over you all. If you can hang with just 1 or 2 more minutes. Tony, you're doing our technology for us, and I think I'm not paying you enough attention, both in thanking you and also allowing you to ask a question of substance should you ever wish. So today, are you up, or you want to hold till next week?
No, I just would want to make the comment that what I appreciate, which Professor Tootle has hit on the head, which is why I'm here, is like you have to know what your political belief system is, right? Because it can't just be a reaction against other things. And I think that typically I was raised in a context where I wasn't that clear about it. So this is helping me clear that up, and to say, where do I stand? What is my political belief system? And then I can have a meaningful conversation with somebody without getting super emotional about issues that matter, or don't matter, or whatever to me. So I appreciate it.
A reaction to that, Professor?
No, I mean, it's part of what it's part of why I'm so excited about this. And also that reference to Joe Strummer was just for you, Tony. I don't know if you caught that, but
I did.
So team, just a quick inside stuff. We generally, the professor's got a really eclectic taste. in music that I have no idea what he's talking about. So generally we try to have a Q&A on that. And he's already worked that into it. So we're going to skip it since we're already 11 minutes over this week, but we're going to work that in more consistently. I know you're heading off, Bill. That's cool. If anyone wants to hang on with a couple minutes, we're going to turn off the recording and just kind of do a quick recap. You're always welcome to join us for that, unless we get too big. So thank you. This concludes today's presentation on what it means to be a Republican, philosophy, principles, politics, not politics, but guiding thoughts on what it means to be a Republican. Thank you for joining us. We're here every Friday at 11 o'clock Mountain Time. So 9 o'clock Eastern and 10 o'clock Central, unless the professor or I are on vacation or where one of us are sick. So please join us every Friday if you're interested in our subject matters. Thanks again. So talk to you later. You're welcome to hang on if you wish, but let's stop the recording.